The idea of a US military intervention in Venezuela has hovered over Latin American politics for years. Each time tensions rise, the same question returns. Would Washington ever go beyond sanctions and covert pressure and actually send troops? But another, less dramatic question is just as important and often more frightening for planners in Washington, Caracas, and across the region. Because even if a US invasion succeeded militarily, what comes after could be far more dangerous, messy, and costly than the initial operation itself. Tonight, we take a closer look at why post-invasion challenges in Venezuela could outweigh the immediate military risks, and why this calculation continues to haunt decision-makers on all sides. Venezuela is not a simple battlefield. It's a country of more than 28 million people, with a fractured political system, a devastated economy, deep social divides, and powerful armed actors that do not always answer to the central government. Any foreign intervention would not land on a blank slate. It would land on a society already under stress. Over the past decade, Venezuela has lived through hyperinflation, mass migration, the collapse of public services, and a prolonged struggle for political power between the ruling authorities in Caracas and a patchwork opposition. Millions of Venezuelans have left the country, heading to Colombia, Brazil, the Caribbean, the United States, and beyond. That exodus has reduced pressure inside Venezuela to some extent, but it has also exported the crisis to the region. In this context, some hawkish voices have argued that a decisive US military action could solve the crisis by removing the leadership in Caracas and forcing a rapid transition. On paper, the military balance seems heavily tilted in Washington's favor. US forces have far superior equipment, intelligence and logistics, and Venezuela's armed forces have suffered years of underinvestment, sanctions and internal political purges. But war is not fought on paper, and the risks that come after the shooting starts are precisely what keeps many officials, both in the United States and in neighboring countries, deeply cautious. First, there is the question of legitimacy. No matter how the operation is framed, whether as a humanitarian intervention, a mission to restore democracy, or a response to alleged security threats, many Venezuelans would still see foreign troops as invaders. Latin America carries a long memory of outside interventions, coups, and occupations. That history does not disappear when soldiers land on a runway with a new flag and new promises. Any foreign force in Caracas would struggle from day one with the perception that it had arrived to impose its will, not to empower Venezuelans to decide their own future. Even Venezuelans who are deeply critical of the current leadership might hesitate to welcome foreign tanks in their streets. The memory of past interventions, whether in Central America, the Caribbean, or elsewhere, would fuel suspicion. Regional organizations and neighboring governments would also come under intense pressure from their own populations not to endorse or support a foreign military campaign. This legitimacy gap matters because it shapes what happens after the initial phase of an operation. Removing a government is one thing, governing a country is another. Without local legitimacy, a foreign-backed transition authority could quickly be labelled a puppet, undermining any reforms it tries to launch. Second, the security landscape inside Venezuela is far more complex than a simple government versus opposition narrative. The country hosts a range of armed groups, elements of the armed forces loyal to the current leadership, paramilitary groups, colectivos, criminal organizations, and guerrilla factions that have operated along the border regions. Some have local roots stretching back decades. Others are tied to trafficking networks that cross borders and move drugs, weapons, and money through the wider region. If the central state is weakened or decapitated by an invasion, these groups could seize the moment. Power vacuums rarely stay empty for long. They are filled by whoever has guns, money, and the willingness to use both. In the best-case scenario for an invading force, key units of the Venezuelan military would lay down their arms or switch sides, easing a rapid transition. But in less favourable scenarios, splintered factions could retreat into the interior, the jungles or the border areas, launching insurgent attacks against occupying troops and rival groups. That would transform a short, sharp conflict into a drawn-out, unpredictable guerrilla war. Urban centres would also be at risk. Caracas, Maracaibo, and other major cities have neighbourhoods where state authority is already weak. In a post-invasion environment, criminal gangs and armed collectives could fight for control, turning densely populated areas into flashpoints of violence. For foreign troops, this would mean a difficult choice: either tolerate a high level of local insecurity or move aggressively into areas where heavy operations would inevitably cause civilian casualties. Third, there is the enormous challenge of economic and humanitarian reconstruction. Venezuela's economy has shrunk dramatically over the past decade, with its oil industry, once the backbone of national prosperity, operating at a fraction of its former capacity. Infrastructure has deteriorated, public services have collapsed in many regions, and millions of citizens rely on remittances, informal work, or humanitarian assistance. A foreign military operation that further disrupts the country's already fragile infrastructure, whether intentionally or as collateral damage, could trigger new waves of displacement and desperation. Restoring basic services would require not just money, but time, expertise, and coordination with local actors who know the country and its communities. Any serious analyst looking at the Venezuelan crisis recognizes that a day-after plan would need to be measured in years, not months, years of reconstruction, institution building, and patient diplomacy. That means long-term commitments of funding from the United States, regional partners, and international institutions. It means political will in Washington to sustain attention long after the headlines have moved on. And it means negotiating with a wide spectrum of Venezuelan actors, including those who may not have supported the intervention in the first place. History offers sobering lessons. In other interventions, whether in the Middle East, Central Asia, or elsewhere, initial military success often gave way to years of insurgency, political fragmentation, and reconstruction fatigue. The risk in Venezuela would be no different without a realistic, well-resourced strategy for the aftermath. The country could find itself trapped between weakened state structures and empowered non-state armed groups. Fourth, regional stability is on the line. Venezuela is not isolated. It shares borders with Colombia, Brazil, Guyana, and other neighbours, and its crisis has already spilled over through migrant flows, cross-border smuggling, and security incidents. A foreign military intervention would immediately raise tensions across the region, forcing governments to choose sides or at least define their stance very clearly. Some might offer quiet support, others would openly oppose what they see as a violation of sovereignty and a dangerous precedent. Rival global powers could also seize the moment to deepen their presence in neighbouring countries, creating a new layer of geopolitical competition in Latin America. An invasion of Venezuela would not remain a local event for long. It would reshape security calculations from Bogotá to Brasilia and from Washington to other global capitals. Moreover, neighbouring states would likely face new waves of refugees fleeing the fighting. Their border regions, already under pressure, could see camps expand and local tensions increase as communities struggle to absorb new arrivals. Even if the foreign intervention is short, the social and economic impact on these neighbours would endure. This is one reason why many regional leaders, even those critical of the Venezuelan authorities, have consistently warned against a military solution. For them, the region's stability and their own domestic politics are too closely tied to what happens in Venezuela to risk a large-scale conflict. Fifth, there are serious legal and diplomatic implications. In the 21st century, the language of international law matters. States still act according to national interests, but they also face pressure to justify those actions within legal frameworks: self-defense, responsibility to protect, regional security, and so on. A foreign intervention not explicitly authorized by a broad international coalition or a clear legal mandate would open a storm of debate in global forums. Countries in the region, many of which champion non-intervention and sovereignty as core principles, would argue that any invasion sets a dangerous precedent that could later be used against them. Global powers that oppose US influence in Latin America would likely use diplomatic and economic tools to push back, portraying the intervention as illegitimate and destabilizing. The diplomatic costs of invading Venezuela could linger long after the troops come home, complicating cooperation on trade, climate, migration, and security across the hemisphere. Sanctions, countermeasures, and diplomatic confrontations in international institutions would add another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation on the ground. Sixth, there is the human cost, often the least predictable and most painful part of any military operation. Even with advanced weaponry, precision strikes, and careful planning, war in urban and semi-urban environments inevitably harms civilians. Venezuela's dense cities, aging infrastructure, and fragile health system mean that any large-scale fighting would put ordinary people in extreme danger. Hospitals lacking equipment, neighborhoods with intermittent electricity, and communities already living close to the edge could be pushed into catastrophe. For Venezuelans who have endured years of crisis, the prospect of open warfare is not simply a strategic question, it is a matter of survival. Behind every map, every operation plan, and every geopolitical argument are families, homes, and lives that cannot be restored with a press conference or a treaty. This reality is not lost on humanitarian organizations and regional leaders, many of whom warn that the cure could be worse than the disease if the crisis is treated through invasion rather than negotiation and reform. Finally, there is the question of what kind of Venezuela would emerge from a post-invasion landscape. Even if a new government is installed with international backing, its legitimacy will depend on how it is perceived by Venezuelans themselves. A leadership seen as arriving on the back of foreign tanks might struggle to unify the country, rebuild institutions, and manage powerful interests. Old rivalries inside the opposition could resurface, competing visions could clash, and internal splits could slow or derail reforms. Meanwhile, supporters of the previous authorities, those who feel defeated, sidelined, or persecuted, could form the nucleus of future resistance movements. Without genuine national reconciliation, transitional justice, and inclusive politics, Venezuela could enter a cycle where each election, each policy, and each reform is questioned as the product of foreign design. Post-invasion, Venezuela could easily become a battlefield of narratives. Who really represents the people, who speaks for the nation, and who is defending sovereignty versus serving outside agendas. In such an environment, rebuilding trust in institutions from the courts to the electoral system, from the police to the armed forces, would be one of the hardest tasks of all. For US decision makers, these realities form a daunting checklist of post-invasion risks. Military planners can estimate casualties, map targets, and calculate force requirements. But they cannot fully predict how 28 million people, dozens of armed actors, and a region with its own history of intervention will react once the first shot is fired. That is why, in many internal debates, the question is not simply, can the US win a war in Venezuela? But rather, what does winning even look like 5, 10, or 15 years after the first troops land? Winning might mean a stable democracy, a recovering economy, safe borders, and a population that feels the intervention ultimately improved their lives. But getting there would require a long, expensive, and politically risky commitment that few governments are eager to make. Losing, by contrast, could take many forms: an endless insurgency, a fragmented state, a surge in regional tensions, a spike in migration, and a souring of relations between the United States and much of Latin America. In that scenario, even a quick battlefield victory would look, in hindsight, like the easy part. In the end, the analysis is clear. While the US military might have the power to topple a government in Caracas, the real battle would begin the day after. Post-invasion challenges from legitimacy and security to reconstruction and regional fallout are so vast that they outweigh the immediate military risks. When experts say post-invasion challenges outweigh US military risks in Venezuela, they are warning that the hardest fights are often the ones that do not show up on maps or in casualty figures, but in the long, difficult work of putting a broken country back together. For Venezuela, for the region, and for any power that contemplates intervention, that warning is not just an academic line in an analysis. It is a reminder that in today's world, the true cost of war is measured not only in battles won or lost, but in the decades that follow.